Welcome back. So at this point, I have gotten the illustration to a fairly high level of detail. Often in my process, I'll do mostly just watercolor and colored pencil and don't even ever really do the gouache step, or if I do, it's just in really, really tiny details. But for this illustration and for this Skillshare class in general, I am keeping this super authentic and I'm just taking you guys along with me in this process and letting it unfold naturally. So I didn't necessarily plan on including gouache for sure, but at this point, I feel like the illustration needs it in order to help me to develop a more accurate level of value of lights and darks in the illustration. And then I also think that there are some areas that I have gotten maybe a little bit too neutral in the colors, and I need to push it back more towards saturated. So I think most of the work is going to be done in the main blossom, and I'm going to be using a couple different brands, mainly Holbein Acrylic Gouache, but I also have Winsor & Newton. And the gouache that I'm using, the Holbein gouache, is acrylic based, which means that it does not reactivate once it's wet. Some gouache, even once it's dry, you can add water to it again and reactivate it, the same as you can with certain types of watercolor. But with acrylic based gouache, once it's dry, it is dry. And the reason I'm using acrylic based gouache is because I'm going over the top of colored pencil. And there is still plenty of surface area that hasn't been touched with colored pencil, but the surface area that has been touched with colored pencil has a good amount of wax in it. So I wouldn't really be able to go over the top with something that was just water based, like watercolor. It would just kind of pill up on the surface and wouldn't really sink in. But since the acrylic gouache has a plastic or polymer binder to it, that allows me to put it over the top of colored pencil. And I'm just kind of working my way across the surface with this white initially, trying to get the values up to where I want them. So what happened is, and again, I'm just being really honest and transparent with you guys about my process. What happened in, I feel like, the right side of the blossom is that I got a little bit too neutral and maybe a little bit too dark. So I'm trying to lighten it back up a bit, and I think I'll also add some more saturation. Yeah, and so part of the reason I am being really transparent with you guys about what my process is like at this phase is that I'm hoping that one of the things that this class can communicate is that working in mixed media can be a really great way to deal with some of the curveballs that can come when you're making art. It can allow you to tweak things and pick out a media that will solve the unique problem that you're dealing with. And in this situation for me, that was gouache, since I needed something that would stick to the colored pencils and be fairly opaque. So while it might not have been part of my initial game plan, it is what ended up happening. And that's pretty accurate for how I create pretty much every piece. So I'll start out knowing, yes, for sure, I'm going to use some sort of watercolor or watercolor pencils. And then I'll add on colored pencils. I pretty much always do those two things. But then when it comes down to the final layers, I might just do a few little details with a Sharpie paint pen, or I might do something much more extensive like I'm doing here with the gouache. I might even do something a little bit different, like a wax pastel or an oil bar. Basically, I just kind of let the piece tell me what it needs. And for this piece in this situation, it was telling me it needed gouache. So that is why we are doing what we're doing. All right, so at this point, I am starting to mix in some color and try to add some warmth back to the inside of some of those petal areas. Now, these did have yellow in them, but I just felt like it wasn't quite saturated enough. And moving on to the gouache as opposed to the colored pencil allows me to kind of cover up some of the neutral, more muted colors that I had down there with a more saturated color. So I could have just gone over the top with a more saturated colored pencil, but the colored pencils just don't have the same level of opacity as the gouache does. All right, so I'm speeding it up again here. Just continuing to add that warmth, that sort of golden yellow. The color that I'm using is, again, a cadmium type yellow. All right, so at this point, I have put a little bit of magenta on my palette, and I'm mixing that with some white and a tiny bit of cooler yellow to try to create a cooler pink tone that's going to go on the outside of some of the petals on the right-hand side of the blossom. And again, I'm just doing the same, I had that same goal in mind of increasing the level of saturation. And I'm also trying to make sure that I keep the petals that are on the right-hand side of the blossom, keep the pink in those petals at least, more of a cooler pink to really help it read as a shadow. I'm also taking this opportunity to add in some structural details of the petal. In the reference image, I feel like I see kind of like a stripiness to certain petals. So I'm allowing myself to get a bit more graphic with the application of the paint here to try to really communicate that effect. All right, now at this point, I'm going to twist my paper again, and I'm going to transition to working just a little bit on the smaller blossom. Now, this doesn't need a whole lot, but I do want to add a few areas of, again, that more intense color in the tops of the petals, the areas that are really kind of catching the highlight. I feel like I got a bit too desaturated, so I want to add something that is still very saturated, but very, well, not very light, but very saturated and somewhat light at the same time. So I've mixed up basically just the magenta and lightened it a little bit with the white. So it is very saturated, hasn't been really knocked down at all with any sort of complementary color. And I'm just hitting some of the highlights in this blossom. And I want to really reserve most of the pure white for the big blossom because that is so much lighter overall than the little blossom. So having a color as a highlight here in the smaller blossom is going to really help me do that. All right, so I'm just finishing up here with the gouache. I have pretty much just only used it on the two blossoms, mostly primarily as you have seen on the larger blossom with a little bit on the smaller blossom, but haven't really used any on the leaves or the greenery. And that is because those are really the only places that I feel like it was needed. So I'm going to stop now and let it dry. And then after this, I will move on to finishing touches and getting this piece wrapped up. All right, so a quick review. My main goal in this phase of the painting was to use gouache to correct the color and value that had gotten a little bit off kilter in the large blossom. So I talked about how using mixed media can be useful for that, for correcting mistakes. And then I used a white acrylic-based gouache to lighten some of the areas that had gotten too dark. And then I used colored acrylic-based gouache to add saturation and to tweak the temperature.